is the Director of the Rule of Law and Governance Program at Arizona State University's Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, and she's based in DC. Prior to that, she was at the US Department of State. And Julia is an alumna of our Young Leaders Program, and she's also on the board of the foundation. So Julia, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you very much, Katie, for that introduction and welcome. And I would like to welcome Ben Haddad, who is the director of the Future Europe Initiative at the Atlantic Council in Washington, DC. He is also the author of the 2019 book, Paradise Lost, Trump's America and the End of European Illusions. Did I get it right? Good. And thank you, Ben, so much for taking the time to talk with us today. The way that for the audience, the way that we will do this today is Ben and I will have a discussion. I'll pose some questions to Ben for the first bit of this, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. So if you have a question at any point, please put it in the either in the Q&A or in the chat. Both buttons should be at the bottom of your screen if you're using Zoom on a computer. So Ben, I would like to start off by asking, by saying that in 2019, you published both your book and a piece in Foreign Affairs called What Comes After the Transatlantic Alliance. You published that with Alina Polyakova. And in those, in the article, and I believe in your book, you argued in part that nostalgia for a pre-Trump transatlantic order is misplaced. And that Europe needs to come to its own defense and to unify and work more through Brussels in order to do so. So my first question to you is, what would a strong transatlantic relationship without this nostalgia, or not based on this nostalgia, what would that look like?
Yeah, thanks, Julia. And first, thank you to the French American Foundation for organizing this. It's really a pleasure to be with you, and thanks for everyone for joining us for this conversation. Yeah, you mentioned it in both the articles that we wrote with Alina, which had a sort of a more American angle, and then the book I wrote in French last year. I think the purpose for us was to take a step back from Trump, basically. And there's been so much focus on this idiosyncratic presidency, the tweets, the rhetoric, the also specific policies that I think hurt the transatlantic relationships, like the trade wars and tariffs against European allies. But take a step back and sort of look at the longer trend. And what we wanted to say was actually Trump on many of these issues, and especially when it comes to US policy towards Europe, is more a symptom, an accelerator of pre-existing trends that existed already under Obama. President Obama was the one who announced the pivot to Asia, was also very critical of what he called Europeans free riding on US military umbrella, and the fact that European allies were not pulling through when it came to burden sharing and defense spending. Obviously, this has been a key issue for President Trump, with the famous 2% of GDP that should be spent by allies on defense. We've seen also a decrease of US military presence in Europe. So you see these trends that pre-exist. And I think because there's been so much focus on the personality and the antics of President Trump in the last few years, both sides of the Atlantic, we sort of lose sight of this. And what I've been trying to tell Europeans was, don't wait Trump out. Don't just think that if he loses in 2020 or in 2024, we're just going to wake up from an aberration, a nightmare, and everything is going to go back to sort of golden age or normal, where the US will be committed to this relationship, will be anchored in Europe, and will be providing security and leadership for Europeans. And so I think one way to answer this challenge is, and by the way, I think that if you look at today's context and the fact that both sides of the Atlantic are facing the pandemic, are facing an unprecedented economic crisis, and the US is also reckoning with issues of identity and race, and a priority that's turning more and more to the strategic rivalry with China. And that's something that's completely bipartisan in the United States, clearly Europe is taking a backseat in the priorities. I think part of it is good. I say this as a European, as someone who's committed to this relationship and works on it. That also means it's, the Cold War is over. The systemic and central aspect of the rivalry with the Soviet Union is behind us. That's the reason why Europe was the main theater of US foreign policy in the second part of the 20th century. So there is good news to this. But that also means that Europeans now have to step up, take care of themselves, invest in their own security and defense. A lot of the issues in European periphery that have a direct impact on European security, where the conflict in Syria that both the Obama and Trump administration decided to avoid, to not get dragged into. We see right now a lot of tensions in Libya. All of these conflicts have direct consequences, both in terms of terrorism, but also migration flows on Europe, and Europeans have not been able to really step up, to really try to have an impact and shape the resolution on these conflicts, mostly hoping and relying on the United States to do so, and it hasn't been the case. And once again, this is something that has been bipartisan. We see in the US, I think, a lot of skepticism about new conflicts in the Middle East for legitimate reasons since the war in Iraq. So my book has really been a call on Europeans to unite and to be able to finally reconcile themselves with power on the world stage and defend their own interest in security. And the last point on this, and that's really a point that we make in that foreign affairs article with Alina Polyakova that you mentioned, is that this, we believe, Europeans investing in their own interest, in their own autonomy, in their sovereignty, as European leaders like Macron are talking about, is paradoxically the thing that will save the transatlantic going forward. If American policymakers, but also American public opinion, see that Europeans are valuable allies, that actually they bring in value added in the conversation, this is, I think, where you can really shape a forward-looking and I think a more balanced transatlantic relationship going forward.
And you said at the beginning of that, you said that you're encouraging Europeans not to wait until 2021, it would be, or 2020, until the 2024 elections. But a lot of the, to bring China into this also, since the title of this talk is the US-Europe China Triangle and its geopolitical challenges, a lot of what you've talked about is the role of China, of the US and China in the multilateral institutions. What happens if Trump wins a second term? Does the expected further withdrawal of the US from multilateral institutions or from engagement with them, and the rise of the further engagement of China with them, does that change what you see as the role of Europe?
Yeah, first, I think it's been extremely unfortunate that the Trump administration has not worked more with Europeans to shape a common position with China. When you look at the assets that the US has in this strategic rivalry, its allies, including its European allies, is one of the key assets, because the rivalry with China is not only, and I would say not even primarily, about military issues. You have security questions in the South China Sea, freedom of navigation, but it's really about what kind of globalization do we want? What are the rules of trade, of privacy on technology and digital issues? How do we push back against spying, against hidden subsidies to competition? How do we basically level the playing field to make sure that China plays by the same rules of competition that the European Union and the United States does? And in this respect, having the EU on your side, one of the main norm and standard setter on all these issues, on question of competition, on question of digital regulation, on question of privacy, is on the environment, obviously, is really key and would be an asset. Unfortunately, I think the president has not been really interested in this. He has a very bilateral approach when dealing with China. He's very focused on trade numbers and trying to find a trade agreement that will rebalance trade numbers. When he's been asked by reporters, why don't you work with the EU on China, he said, the EU is even worse than China, and we'll focus on the EU after we have a trade deal with China. I don't think that's the right approach. We see some changes now. For example, just last week, Secretary of State Pompeo announced with the High Representative of the EU, Joseph Borrell, a strategic dialogue between the US and the EU to try to shape a common position on China. And I think that's long overdue and that should be a priority. The problem is that, once again, as you mentioned in your question, the EU is obviously by design very interested in multilateral approaches and conversations to fix common problems. Take the example of trade. The EU and the US, when you listen to the leaders, actually share a lot of the concerns over copyright, over spying, over subsidies in China. But the EU considers that this should be better resolved by the WTO. We have an arena, we have international institutions to deal with these issues, and we could bring together the US and the EU those complaints at the WTO framework. Instead, the Trump administration has decided to basically withdraw from the organization because it's been blocking the nomination of judges on the appellate court of the WTO. So it's making these organizations ineffective. Another example is the WHO that we've been talking a lot about, obviously, during the pandemic, the World Health Organization. The Trump administration has been very critical of the WHO's performance during this pandemic, especially at the beginning. The fact that the organization has sort of repeated some Chinese talking points about COVID-19, and some of these critics are actually correct and they're legitimate and they're shared by Europeans. But the reason why China and others are influential within these forums is precisely because the US has been withdrawing progressively. The best way to push back is not to withdraw even more, not to end the funding, but would be to reinvest these organizations alongside Europeans and push for a real reform agenda. So I think there would be a lot of space for cooperation here with the United States and the EU. But unfortunately, if you have this sort of unilateral approach and push back against these international organizations, other countries are going to step in the vacuum, and China has been very effective at doing this in the last few years.
So one of the problems, I think, also with the unilateral approach of the US is it encourages or plays into countries in Europe that would prefer to take a unilateral approach rather than working through Brussels. And just to take one example, Poland will have a runoff election in a couple of weeks. And I think it's seen as, I'm by no means an expert on Poland, but I think it's seen as a decision between a populist moving towards moving away from the liberal order, and then the mayor of Warsaw, who would be more closer to Brussels. So there's no matter what happens in the US, there are, with our elections in November, there are internal divisions in Europe, whether it's looking at the rise of right-wing populists in Poland and Hungary, or Italy, that is now, I think, has signed on to China's Belt and Road Initiative. So how do you see Europe coming together on some of these difficult issues? I understand that on norm setting, on some things like the GDPR, they've been very successful, but on issues where, such as defense, where there have been long differences of opinion or unwillingness to invest, how do you see what will convince European countries actually to come together?
Yeah, I think you asked the toughest questions here, and I think there's no clear-cut answer. I would say that I don't think we have much of a choice, and that actually you see a lot of converging interest. If you take, for example, a crisis that has unfortunately reinforced a lot of divisions within Europe, like in 2015, the migration crisis. At the same time, and there's been a lot of divisions because you had, as you mentioned, some populist right-wing governments in Central Europe, like Hungary and Poland, that really pushed back against opening up to refugees coming out of Syria. You had other governments, and especially Germany, led by Chancellor Merkel, much more open to welcoming them. But interestingly, when you look at opinion polls all across Europe, you did have a demand for at least stronger border control and a more coordinated approach to controlling the borders. You know, we have the Schengen area free circulation within the European Union, which is, I think, has been one of the most tremendous achievements of the European Union, the ability to just travel without a visa, without borders from a country to another. But at the same time, we didn't accompany this with strong border control at the external borders of the European Union, stronger solidarity. So clearly we had instruments that didn't work. And we saw also this migration crisis was the consequences of a foreign policy crisis, was the consequence of the crisis in Syria, the humanitarian disaster in Syria, in which the EU wasn't really stepping up. So I think you can see common interests here where you could build a united European position. But, you know, foreign policy, defense issues, they're still very much linked to the sovereignty of member states. A lot of the European Union has been built mostly through economic issues and soft issues. You mentioned some of the successes like GDPR, which is the privacy of data that's being exchanged at the European Union. And you still see a lot of divisions. Some of these divisions have been made even more apparent by COVID, as we've seen on economic issues, this distinction between northern state and southern state, on the integration of the Eurozone, the creation of Eurobonds. And we see still divisions on foreign policy matters between the East and the West. I think the Trump administration has also sort of accelerated this by, as you mentioned, playing more bilateral relations with specific countries. And so, you know, having very strong ties, for example, with Poland or with others at the expense of a more united approach, which I think would be even in the interest of the United States. I think the US would be better off with a stronger, more robust, united partner than a bunch of small and divided ones. I think that's going to be a generational challenge. I think you see some things going in the right direction, ramped up defense efforts. You know, it's very technical and kind of boring to talk about it in campaigns and everything, but all these acronyms that the European Union loves, PESCO, EDF, but that basically means more resources, more coordination on more intelligence sharing, on security matters. But I think it's still a long-term challenge. One possibility is, you know, if President Trump is reelected, this might act as a wake-up call for Europeans to say, okay, now, you know, we have to heed the message and we do have to get our act together a little more. But I will say, because I like to be a little grumpy about these issues, that I do think there's also a risk to a Biden presidency that I think would be much more positive in its rhetoric towards European. I think we would work together on global challenges in a much more positive way, especially on fighting climate change. But at the same time, I'm a little concerned that we would see a continuation of some of the trends of disengagement coming from a Biden administration, but that a more positive rhetoric about common values and the importance of our allies would kill any kind of momentum in Europe for getting organized. So I think even the Biden administration needs early on to be very frank and very clear with Europeans, saying we care about you as allies. We want to work with you. We have common challenges from climate to China, but we do need you to take on more responsibility. And this is not something that's going to change.
I think it's useful to remember that seeing the Obama days as the halcyon days is only through the lens of the Trump administration, not right. What we were thinking at the very end of that administration. I'm going to pose one more question and then open it up to the audience. I have others, but I'm going to limit myself to one for now. Do you see, we're still very much in the midst of the pandemic, even if many people around our country are pretending that we have it under control and that it's waning. Do you see the pandemic changing any of what you have previously written about, whether it's because of the need for governments to respond to the economic cataclysm, because of the travel bans going each way between the EU and the US, or because the US has had I would say a pathetic response? That you look at I think it was a New York Times graph that showed all the European countries going down, and the US had gone up, plateaued, gone down a little bit, plateaued, and then started up again. And I can see that as possibly further damaging the reputation of the US, or just how Europeans see the US. And I'm wondering if there are obvious problems in China, which don't get that much attention, at least on the streets, things like the Hong Kong protests and the treatment of Uyghurs, the security law in Hong Kong that was just passed yesterday. But there may be more of I can imagine that one of the responses in Europe to the pandemic will be, especially if China comes out of it faster than the US does, that China's appeal will increase. And I'm wondering how I know this is complicated, there are a lot of different pieces to the pandemic, but I'm wondering if you see it as changing anything that you'd previously been writing about.
Well, so there's always a joke in my world that you always say, COVID completely changes the world, and thus it confirms everything that I thought beforehand. So I think we're all trying to grasp a little bit with this. And the truth is, I think it's too soon to tell. I think very early on, we all knew that we were in a completely unprecedented kind of event, and we said this is going to change the world. And I think now there's a sort of consensus among experts that this is an accelerator of trends that existed before. But as you mentioned, the US is not really out of the first phase. Europe still might face a second phase. We don't exactly know where China stands right now in tackling the pandemic. But I think there's a few elements that are clear. The first one is that the US response, both domestically and on the global stage, has been disastrous, and it's really going to be a blow in terms of US leadership and soft power. We saw this very early on, where the administration, instead of trying to coordinate with allies and show solidarity, on the contrary, closed borders immediately in an uncoordinated way. Closing borders was probably the right thing to do, but did it in a sort of confrontational and uncoordinated way, and then was very inward-looking in its response. I do think, however, that you mentioned China, and there was a fear among a lot of observers that China would use this moment to ramp up its outreach to Europeans, to continue to try to play its partition. But I think it actually kind of fumbled its propaganda outreach. I think it was too transparent. I think it's too aggressive. There's only one country, I think that's Italy, that's been the most hard-hit country in Europe, that actually has a better opinion of China coming out of the pandemic. I saw a poll yesterday that said that I think something like more than 60%, 69% of French citizens actually had a worse opinion of China since the pandemic, and it's something that's sort of across the board all over Europe. They also have a worse opinion in the United States, to be fair. But so this has not also been a soft power moment for China. And I think for Europeans, the jury is still out. We saw a lot of divisions early on. Obviously, national interest taking over when it came to procurement of masks, of testing equipment. But I think fairly quickly, Europeans took their responsibility. First, the European institutions. It's important to remember, by the way, that health is not a prerogative of the European Commission. So that's why you saw some divisions, because mostly member states that had to respond in a dispersed way. Economically, though, we saw the European Central Bank react very quickly and actually take maybe just a few weeks to do what took 4 years last time, which is say that the central bank would do whatever it takes to save the euro and invest massively in an unprecedented fashion on financial markets. We saw then member states starting, Germany and Luxembourg taking French patients across the border to treat them, and then obviously the announcement by President Macron and Chancellor Merkel, the European recovery package, which is clearly a step in the right direction in shoring up instruments for solidarity and redistribution. I think we also see now, and that's something that we can discuss more in detail, more European announcements when it comes to protecting the single market and the European Union from China. The Vice President of the European Commission, Margrethe Vestager, said we want a level playing field. We won't accept to have Chinese companies that benefit from subsidies investing in Europe and competing with European companies that are not allowed to take these kind of subsidies. We saw Joseph Borrell say that the EU had been naive about China. So I think one more example that in this great power competition, a united Europe on all the issues from defense and security to trade and digital matters make more sense and can better protect countries than when they're isolated and divided. But once again, I would still be very cautious about the long-term consequences of this. And I'm kind of very curious to see in 20, 30 years, when people look back to 2020, what will be the main thing that they will remember. It might be something very different from what we currently think.
Yeah, that will be interesting. I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience now. I see that I have a couple of questions. Okay, so the first one from Ambassador Jim Lowenstein. Hi, Jim. With the exception of Hungary and Poland, my impression from public opinion polls is that the Europeans have lost faith in the US as a reliable ally. Even if Biden is elected, do you think that faith can be renewed, or is this faith permanently fractured? And I'll just, Jim Lowenstein, if you don't know him, is one of the founders of the French-American Foundation.
Yeah, look, I think it's clearly a challenge. Some of it is linked to President Trump, his personality, both his attacks against Europe, but also his stances on issues from JCPOA to climate change or racial issues that are very anathema to how Europeans think about this. So I think some of it can be rebuilt. I'm a little concerned about misunderstandings about let's say, too high expectations coming from Europeans from the Biden team. But look, I will say something that really struck me, and I wrote about this recently. It has been the European reaction to the protest after the death of George Floyd here in the United States. You know, so we just came out on both sides of the Atlantic from 3 months of lockdown. And during the lockdown, a lot of the commentary was about, it's the end of the American moments, the rise of the Asian century. And yet the first global event coming out of lockdown is something that started in Minneapolis. And we've seen so many protests in Europe that just felt inspired by what was going on in the United States, that took a lot of the references, the vocabularies, the struggle of American protesters, but also to resonate within their own society. The example of France, where Assa Traoré, the sister of Adama Traoré, a young man who was killed in police custody 4 years ago, she led the protest. So and it happened 4 years ago, but it was reignited by the death of George Floyd. So that does say something. That does say, and parts of these protests in Europe were about solidarity with Black Lives Matter. Part of them were also, I think, a sign of disappointment, clearly, with the Trump administration and maybe with the United States not stepping up to its values on these issues. And they showed this sort of schizophrenic approach, I think, that Europeans have toward America, where sometimes you'll have protests against an American administration with people drinking American soda and being dressed with American clothes and filled with American cultural references everywhere. So these ties, these cultural and value ties, they're much deeper, I think, than individual leaders, and obviously they will continue beyond Joe Biden. The question is, though, and that I don't have an answer for that. How does that translate into concrete cooperation on policy issues? I think that's another question. But I really believe that you also have these deeper bonds that organizations like the French-American Foundation continue also to sustain.
Thank you. And Fanny Robin asks, could you speak to the EU's new travel restrictions on the US and China, and how you think they will impact the relationship between all three?
Okay, it was just announced today. We were actually talking about it in the green room and how it affects all of our vacation plans. So first, it clearly says a lot about the distrust on the European side when it comes to the US response to the pandemic. You have to remember that 3 months ago in March, when President Trump closed the borders to Europeans, he basically blamed the Europeans for bringing this virus to the United States. He called it a foreign virus, and now we see the situation being reversed with Europeans not letting Americans in. I would expect the administration to retaliate and also bar the opening to European citizens. I think that's just probably unavoidable in the current context, but I do think this will have lasting consequences, and these are things that will probably outlast any administration. The sort of distrust and bad blood that the last few months will have left, I think, for many citizens. And I think for many of us who care about the transatlantic relationship, who actually love crossing the Atlantic and being part of these bridges, it's also a very sad moment.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions from the audience right now. If there are any, please add them to the Q&A or to the chat. So I will pose another question myself. The EC, I think, has called China a systemic rival, and I understand from what you just said, and what you've written about the protests after the George Floyd murder, showing, in your view, indicating higher expectation, not only cultural affinity, but higher expectations of the U.S. Than for China, when we haven't seen similar protests about in support of the democracy protesters in Hong Kong or against the treatment of Uyghurs in China, for example. But there's also in the US and in Europe, I think, there are opinion polls showing a less, at least among the younger generation, a weaker view or a weaker view of democracy, or that people are not, do not see as a democratic government as being as important for themselves as previous generations did. Do you think that the fact that the U.S. is not fulfilling expectations will help drive people more towards China, because people who would otherwise be protesting may not care as much about China's activities. They may not care as much about China's anti-democratic activities, and they would see the economic growth of China as being more appealing. So do you think that the high expectations of the US may work against us or against the relationship?
It's a really interesting question. We've seen a lot in the last few years, what some call new authoritarian models emerge, propped up by Russia to a large extent, but also by China. It's sort of fascination for strong men in populist movements from the left and from the right, and obviously an erosion of liberal democracy that's been analyzed by many organizations like Freedom House and others that have seen this decline of liberal democracy. And the sentiment that you point out, when you see a lot of opinion polls of people asking for the military to take over, showing less and less trust in the media, in Congress in the United States, in traditional representative institutions, and that's something that's across generation. It depends on countries, but in a country like France, the first party among young voters under 25 is the National Front. It's the far right. So there's also, we sometimes have this cliche view that young generations are necessarily more progressive or more pro-European, more internationalist, but it's actually even less and less the case in some countries. And I think clearly this is a trend that has benefited countries like Russia, who have first propped up this through interference in our democracies, for supporting populist movements, and being involved within social media in our democratic debates. However, I think the only answer to this is actually domestic. I think countries like Russia, and to a certain extent China, are only basically free riding on the failures and the very real limits of our own systems. We have seen since the 90s, for example, free trade that hasn't delivered for everyone. When you look at the integration of China within international trade and within WTO, it is true that it had a negative impact on jobs and work in certain areas in the Rust Belt in the United States. It's been documented by universities. Like there's an interesting paper called the China Shock, for example, that was released by MIT, saying actually that on average, international trade and including China within world trade was a net positive for everyone, but it did destroy certain industries and did have a disproportionate impact on certain areas in the Rust Belt. These are areas that shifted dramatically from Democrats to Donald Trump in the last election, and with a discourse of protectionism and border control and immigration control, the president managed to reach out to them the same way that you have this same discourse that's very popular in Europe. I think another issue than trade is immigration. You can have I think an open and generous approach to immigration and welcoming refugees, while at the same time, like I did earlier, recognize that some of the instruments that we had to at least control this immigration and control the borders did not function at the European level, and that the success of Schengen was not compensated with investing in common borders at the external borders of the European Union, and that countries like Italy or Greece, where we've seen obviously a huge upsurge in populism in the last few years, were left alone, were basically abandoned by their European partners to deal with the immigration shock on their own. So I think it's really necessary to have a moment of lucidity, to have a serious conversation about the inequalities, about the flaws of our system, how they've brought about this progressive distrust towards elite, and not only look to foreign factors like Russia. And I think that's been a little bit too much the case, both in France and the United States these last few years. Focus a lot on the external aspect at the expense of just having a debate about how we can just speak to these voters, speak to the very legitimate grievances and difficulties that they face in their daily lives.
That might be a great topic for a future webinar of the French American Foundation, getting voices from each side. And even though you just said that the role of Russia has maybe been overstated, I did want to ask about Russia. You brought it up also at the beginning of that answer. And do you see, I recognize that the relationships with Russia and with China are multifaceted and complex and cannot be boiled down to one word or two words, but do you see Russia's role in the relationship between the EU and the US as being entirely a threat to that relationship, or do you think that in some ways it could bring that relationship closer together?
Well, the problem is that first, it's very complicated to understand right now, and for the last 3 years, what the US policy on Russia has been. Unfortunately, the Russia issue has become a partisan issue in the United States. There hasn't been a real strategic conversation about this. The Obama administration had a two-pronged approach. In the first term, the president had tried to reset with Vladimir Putin. That basically failed. And after 2014 and the aggression on Ukraine, you have seen actually a common transatlantic front to first reassure NATO allies on the eastern shore, so but the Baltic states and Poland, and send more troops to ensure their security, build the sanction regime against China, and try to support Ukraine, and especially the reforms and the Ukrainian economy. Now we're sort of in an ambiguous situation where both the United States and Europe still uphold the sanction regime. Actually, under the Trump administration, the sanction regime has been strengthened by both Congress and the administration, especially after the Skripal case in the UK, the assassination of a former Russian agent in the United Kingdom, probably by Russian security agencies. And yet, at the same time, obviously, we hear the President Trump saying that he wants to get along with Russia, trying to improve relationship with Moscow. So we haven't had a clear policy towards Russia coming from the United States. On the European side, you have some form of unity within NATO, as I said, for the troops' presence in Eastern Europe, for the sanction regime. But then you also have a lot of differences, especially between East and West. For countries like Poland and the Baltic states, the presence of Russia, the memory of the Soviet Union is considered an existential challenge and threat. And this also brings them to invest heavily in the relationship with the United States. We saw the Polish President Duda was in Washington a couple of weeks ago. He's the first foreign leader to come to the United States since the beginning of the pandemic, basically. And we've seen announcements of increased U.S. presence in Poland as a result. But then at the same time, obviously, President Macron has been trying to have another kind of policy, not really breaking ranks with solidarity on sanctions or on Ukraine. His position has stayed firm on this, but at the same time, trying to open up a new form of dialogue with Russia. And his objective, you mentioned China, his objective is down the road to try to break a potential rapprochement between China and Russia and say, if we consider China to be our main strategic challenge, then we have an interest in keeping Russia close. I think for the moment, this dialogue has not led to very concrete results, but at the same time, it's also not very costly for Europeans because it hasn't led Europeans to give up any of the instruments of pressure and leverage that we currently have on Russia. I think that if you have an administration tomorrow, you'll probably see a more hawkish, a tougher stance on Russia coming from the administration.
Thank you. And I just got another question in the chat, which is, it's hard to believe that 6 months ago, a lot of people interested in Europe were talking about Brexit, which it seems years ago at this point. But do you think that things like Brexit have had an impact on the U.S. and China? You've talked about the impact of U.S. unilateralism on politics in Europe, but is the inverse happening also? What effect does Brexit? Do you think Brexit has either on the ability of the EU to come together in the way that you think they need to, or that you think the countries need to, or the effect that it's had on the relationship between the EU and the US and China?
Well, I mean, first, if you look at the UK was the main partner of the United States in Europe. Some even, if you're French, you often resented this because you saw the UK as sort of the Trojan horse of the United States within the European Union. But it's clear that Brexit has been a direct hit to American interest in Europe. I think it's been a direct hit to Europe because it's been a gigantic distraction. It's been a factor of division within Europe. But clearly, the US used to have a key partner sharing a lot of its strategic concerns to make that case within Europe, and now it has to find other partners. And this is why I think also we've seen the US step up the relationship with Poland. But the truth is also President Macron and President Trump speak a lot and talk a lot about strategic challenges. They intervened together in Syria, if you remember 2 years ago, after the use of chemical weapons against Syrian civilians. So I think first it's been a hit for the US in its ability to make its case to Europeans. The second one is that one theme that's been very prevalent in UK circles, especially around Boris Johnson, is the question of global Britain. It's basically say, we're leaving the European Union to find new partners, to be more nimble in our foreign policy, to be able to conclude trade relationships with other countries. And obviously, as you see this, well, you see the UK tempted to turn to China. And we've seen this debate with the question of 5G networks in the United Kingdom, and the UK being the first major country to turn to Huawei to provide its 5G networks, which led to very strong tensions between the United States and the United Kingdom. There's been a shift in position, though, recently, especially because of Hong Kong, which is for obvious reasons, a very symbolic issue for the United Kingdom. The Johnson administration decided to offer asylum to hundreds of thousands of Hong Kong residents if they need to flee. And so we've seen toughened rhetoric here. So maybe room for cooperation also between the United States, the UK, and the EU on China. But look, at the end of the day, the main impact of Brexit right now is just, as I said, the gigantic distraction that it represents. The fact that we have so many economic and foreign policy challenges, and that we're still discussing, we're still inward looking, we're still navel gazing and discussing our own arrangements when we should be talking about what we want to do together and how we can face together these common challenges. You know, earlier you were asking me what has COVID changed and what are the foreign policy consequences of COVID. And you know, one thing that we're not talking about that much is the consequences it will have in the neighborhood of Europe. You know, when you have countries on the other side of the Mediterranean, or in the Western Balkans, or in Central Asia, that will face, for example, the economic cost of the pandemic, with obviously institutions that are less stable, with financing needs that will be much higher and much more difficult to sustain than in Europe. What's going to happen? What impact will it have on migration flows? Who is going to step up? Is it China that will come in with a form of Belt and Road on steroids to get even more invested in those regions, to lend more with the risk that it represents in terms of debt traps to these countries? These are sort of these are some of the risks that I think are not really in the conversation right now. It's normal that both Americans and Europeans want to first protect the health and security of their own citizens, that they think about the economic well-being of their own citizens. But as we discuss the long-term consequences of this pandemic, we have to think also about the countries around us and how we can respond to the situation there.
It is remarkable, the short attention spans, which in some ways are forced on us by the crises that keep piling up. But the fact that immigration dominated headlines not that long ago, and I think we have to expect that it will again. So I am not very familiar with the European Defence Fund, but I think that, but you had mentioned it earlier, that and the Permanent Structured Cooperation, or PESCO. I think that the Trump administration increased the US contribution to the European Defense Fund. Is that right?
No, so it's a little different.
Okay.
I think what you're mentioning, we think about is the deterrence initiative, European, sometimes called the defense initiative.
Yes.
On the European, so on the US side, it's the Pentagon program for US presence in Eastern Europe. And it's true that it's one of the things that are a little schizophrenic about the Trump administration, is that it has increased US presence in Eastern Europe, especially in Poland. Recently, the administration announced in a very unilateral and uncoordinated way withdrawal of US troops from Germany, 10,000 troops from Germany. But I think some of them might go to Eastern Europe, where it would serve for the reassurance towards Russia. These other projects, PESCO and EDF, are basically projects that have been built by the European Union in recent years to sort of first find resources to fund common projects and really increase interoperability and coordination at the European level. When you look at European defense spending writ large, the European Union is the second defense spender in the world after the United States. Does that translate into real capabilities, into real ability to sustain missions? It doesn't. And the reason why it doesn't is because you have so many redundancies, you have uncoordinated spending, you have equipments that are not operable with each other. So what the European Union is doing is saying, well, first, everyone has to increase their defense spending in general. And unfortunately, it's going to take a hit with the response to the pandemic. But two, let's also do it in a more coordinated way at the EU level, but also at the NATO level, where we just we look at the needs that we have, the shortages, we can work together to address them. If you really want to get into the nitty-gritty, the truth is actually the US is also a little schizophrenic about this, because on the one hand, it asks Europeans to increase their defense spending and be take more of the burden within the alliance, but it's also very skeptical of these EU projects because some see it as forms of protectionism, on the European level to prop up the European defense industry, because a lot of these funding would go to European defense contractors. So there's been some tensions for the 4 or 5 people of us who care about this. There's been some tension in the last few years about exactly what shape and form these projects would take. And here again, I would say, I think a gigantic distraction when you look at the broader challenges that we face.
So that, I have 2 really different questions following up on that. So I'll pose them both and you can choose which to answer. One is whether the efforts to coordinate more on the European side, on the European defense side, whether you think that is driven at all by the PLA's probing, which some see as the lead up to a potential hot war down the road, whether it's probing in the Ladakh region of India, whether it's the role of the military in Hong Kong or elsewhere, South China Sea, and et cetera. So that's one question, whether the specter of the Chinese military strength drives part of that coordination. My very separate question is whether you think the US, whether it's under Biden or under Trump, can handle a stronger and more unified Europe that has a stronger military, in the sense that, as you've written in one of your pieces, and one of your recent pieces, if the US is calling on Europe to spend more on defense, the United States has to expect at the same time that Europe won't necessarily be the submissive partner and follow the US lead in NATO or in other fora. So do you think that the US is really ready for this?
So on your first question on whether it's linked to PLA probing and Chinese activity, it's part of a broader spectrum. I think there's just an increased sense of insecurity coming out of Europe in the last few years. I call my book Paradise Lost because I think that the EU was built on this idea that you would be able to transcend conflict, transcend hard power, replace it with economics and rules and norms. And when you look at the European continent, it's been an extraordinary success. Obviously, we just came out of 70 years of peace. We brought in Central and Eastern European countries after the collapse of the Iron Wall. So a lot of this was a success, but it has not prepared Europeans well to cope with the rest of the world that actually still believes in these logic of balance of power, of hard power and confrontation, whether it's the United States, Russia, and China in different aspects. There was a famous writer 15 years ago that basically said, you know, the United States lives in the world of Mars, and the Europeans live in the world of Venus. They've built a little paradise, and they think that the rest of the world acts that way. And I think Europeans have lost this paradise. I think basically the different hits that they took from the Euro crisis, the migration crisis, Brexit, the election of Donald Trump, the aggression against Ukraine, and basically just Russian revanchism, and now the looming emergence of China have reignited this sense that Europeans need to think differently about power. We see Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission president, is saying that she wants a geopolitical commission. Joseph Borrell saying that the US needs to reconcile with power. So you hear a lot of rhetoric going in that direction, and it's really sort of a shift for Europeans. Now, does that translate into real action and real resources? That's a different question. I think these things are unfortunately very slow and slower than a lot of us would like them to happen. On your second question, I think that's, for me, it's the most interesting one for the next administration. I plead for a complete mind shift to the way American policymakers think of Europe, which is that you have to accept that if you have a stronger Europe, it will also be a more autonomous Europe. It will be one that will have its own worldview, its own interest, that you'll have more common disagreements. You know, you can make the comparison with a parent and a child. You know, your child grows up and you want your child to grow up and to take more responsibility and autonomy. That's what parenting is. But then your child will make life choices that you don't necessarily approve of. You know, maybe a partner that you're not super fan of, maybe a job and a career that you find a little ludicrous, but you're still a family. And you still, at the end of the day, you have this family bond that's stronger, and that's how families work. And I think there's no going around this. I think the idea that you could have a partner that's stronger, but without being more ambitious, without having its more of its own vision, is impossible. But I see this as an optimist. I still, and I mentioned this earlier, I still think we have these bonds, we have these common values, and I still think we have common interest. When you look at, the European Union being between the United States and China, I do think we have much more in common with the US, even though we can work with China from trade to climate change. So I think the US has to be ready to accept a partner that will be sometimes a little more disruptive, that will have more disagreements, a relationship that can be sometimes more confrontational. But when we agree, then we'll have so much more impact together because you'll have a stronger Europe.
Thank you very much. And I like the analogy, especially because during the pandemic, I think a lot of my friends and I have been talking about how it feels like our parents are our teenage children. We keep telling them we're disappointed in their poor judgment and going outside. And so maybe that's the way that Europe is feeling about America right now. The parents are going off the rails. So this brings us just about to the end of our time. So Ben, I want to thank you so much for this really interesting and wide-ranging conversation. It's been terrific. I also want to thank the French American Foundation, Emmeline Foster, who normally would be appearing but is having not great Wi-Fi on the other side of the Atlantic. Katie Damali, Nathalie Bastin, and Val de Monk, who have ably handled it from New York. So thank you very much to all of you. And Ben, I should also ask, even though this is a bilingual or fairly bilingual crowd, will your book be translated into English?
Yes, I need to work on this. I think I need to adapt it a little more to an American audience in the new time, but I'd like to work on this. And I am, by the way, I should say this because maybe some people will be interested on this call. I'm working on another book in French on a completely different topic, which is more about how the French diaspora all across the world, 2.5 million people, view and lives their own national identity. And it's sort of a contribution to the national identity question. We have more French expats today than people living within Paris. It's very unprecedented in French history. So I want to look a little bit into how these people feel about their country.
That sounds fascinating. So thank you again for taking the time and for sharing your expertise with us. It's been a terrific conversation. So Val, I will hand it over to you.
Great. So on behalf of all of us at the Foundation, of course, thank you, Julia and Ben, for joining us today and for bringing some clarity to the complexities of these geopolitical challenges as they develop constantly. For those of you listening in who are interested, our next webinar is this Thursday at 12:30 p.m. on a somewhat related topic about restarting the economy after COVID-19. So thank you to everyone, to our speakers, everyone who joined in, and we hope to see you soon. Bye, everyone.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.